Hello, Reformed mythologist Nate Morgan Locke here. This video is about an email I received several months ago, and which for some unknown reason I did not respond to.
And perhaps this is because you're profoundly disorganized and don't like doing things on your computer. Maybe you could work on that.
Yeah, you're probably right. This was a great email, a fabulous email, which was on exactly the kind of topic I like to think about.
Guilty as charged with the stories.
And it came from a guy I was at seminary with. Yes, that's right, I went to seminary. Here's a picture of my first day at seminary. Anyway, we shared a few classes, including one on the apologetics of C.S. Lewis. More on him later. Now, as I said earlier, for some reason, when I read this email, I did not reply at the time, and yes, basically, I forgot all about it. But I was delighted when just a few days ago he graciously resent it, with the particular questions included. So here's what he says. I had a question about mythology and Jesus that I thought you might have some insights into. Some months ago I was listening to things about the resurrection, and I was reintroduced to the accusation, usually made by unbelievers atheists, that Christianity is a copycat religion and therefore we shouldn't believe it. So far, I've seen Christians take two different tracks in response to this. One, deny that there is an actual parallel between Jesus and other mythological figures. Say that the proposed comparisons are really tenuous, or you have to deliberately bend things in order to make them fit. I think one example is that Osiris is resurrected, or that Horus was born of a virgin, etc. You have to really stretch the idea of baptism to just some contact with water. I might be misrepresenting it. 2. Go the Tolkien and Lewis route and affirm the parallel, but declare that the parallel is there because unbelievers are picking up on things that God has placed in the world. The dying and rising corn god, but coming to unchristian ends. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm certain this is your preferred way of dealing with it. My question is, are these two paths mutually exclusive? Can we have both?
Both. Both is good.
I certainly like the second option. It's cooler for sure, and it allows us to do things like you've done in popcorn parenting and what others have done. But that's not necessarily the best reasoning. I heard you make the point, drawing from Vern Poythress, that we can't help but copy God. We give back what belongs to you at the dedication of the temple. And I think that makes sense. It goes along with the Reformed presuppositional reading of Romans chapter 1, with man suppressing the truth. But then we have to deal with whether or not these parallels are really legitimate, or if they're just there if you squint real hard and stand 10 meters away. Perhaps I'm just being insecure, but it seems like if there are the parallels, then it would seem that the unbelieving claim would have weight behind it. Why believe that this religion is the right one when I see so many common elements in other religions? It could be a matter of taking things on a case-by-case basis. Some myths do have parallels and some don't. The ones that don't, you option 1. The ones that do, you take option 2. Shouldn't be a matter of simple rhetoric, though. What do you think? What a great email. It's definitely one I should have responded to straight away. It in fact reminded me of this absolutely glorious video from Lutheran satire, Horus Ruins Christmas. It's a strong recommend. Media consumption is optional and all that, but it's very good. The Horus in this video is really funny. God-tier funny. This video brilliantly goes through a whole bunch of the pagan Christ parallels and debunks them in a very funny way. But the email asked about the two options and made explicit reference to the Chronicler of Narnia C.S. Lewis. Now, Lewis's argument on this topic is best expressed in his short article, Myth Became Fact. He says, "The heart of Christianity is a myth which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris dying nobody knows when or where, to a historical person crucified. It is all in order, under Pontius Pilate." For many Christians, the "it actually happened" thing is said a lot louder than the "without ceasing to be myth." But Lewis wants to own the mythic power of the gospel. He goes on, "By becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is the miracle." And then, in the ultimate apologist's judo move,
Oh, I hear your objection. but it actually makes my point even more.
He says, we must not be nervous about parallels and pagan Christs. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. Get in! You can also find Lewis unpacking his view of the myths in his Reflections on the Psalms. I'm not sure it's a great book to read on the Psalms, but it does contain a brilliant little chapter called On Second Meanings. He says, what are we to say of these gods in various pagan mythologies who are killed and rise again, and who thereby renew or transform the life of their worshippers or of nature? Lewis talks about the Christians, who apparently fall into two camps. The early fathers, or some of them, who believed that paganism was nothing but the direct work of the devil, would say, the devil has from the beginning tried to mislead humanity with lies. As all accomplished liars do, he makes his lies as like the truth as he can. Provided they lead man astray on the main issue, the more closely they imitate the truth, the more effective they will be. The resemblance of Adonis to Christ is therefore not at all accidental. It is the resemblance we expect to find between the counterfeit and the real thing, between a parody and the original, between imitation pearls and pearls.
Okay, who's in camp number 1? Pick your sides, Christians. If option 1 wasn't for you, how about option 2?
Other Christians who think as I do that in mythology, divine and diabolical and human elements, the desire for a good story, all play a part, would say, it is not accidental. In the sequence of night and day, in the annual death and rebirth of the crops, in the myths which these processes gave rise to, in the strong if half-articulate feeling embodied in many pagan mysteries that man himself must undergo some sort of death if he would truly live, there is already a likeness permitted by God to that truth on which all depends. You like this? It's good! Divine, diabolical, and human elements in the myths. The challenge is whether it's possible to separate out the strands without the whole thing falling apart. Anyway, Lewis concludes this second section. The resemblance between these myths and the Christian truth is no more accidental than the resemblance between the sun and the sun's reflection in a pond. All right then, Clive, but what should we do about it? Should we read the myths or not?
By the way, just for context, earlier on in the chapter, Lewis mentions Plato writing something about what would happen to a man who was totally righteous. Spoiler, he would be killed. I return you to your regular programming.
When I meditate on the Passion while reading Plato's picture of the righteous one, or on the resurrection while reading Adonis or Balder, the case is altered. There is a real connection between what Plato and the myth makers... Wait, that's just fun.
Well, I first saw Plato and the myth makers in a working men's club in Blackpool. It was the early 60s and they just had that groovy sound, you know what I mean? They just made a real connection.
There is a real connection between what Plato and the myth makers most deeply were and meant and what I believe to be the truth. I know the connection, and they do not. But it is really there. One can, without any absurdity, imagine Plato or the myth makers, if they learned the truth, saying, I see. So that was what I was really talking about. Of course, that is what my words really meant. And I never knew it. So my email friend has excellently summed up the Lewis position. Now, I've not found as much explicitly from Tolkien on this particular subject. I'll be honest, I don't own as much Tolkien stuff, and I don't find him to be as good at getting to the point. He does have a great line about the soup of story, though.
Got soup.
In his well-known On Fairy Stories lecture, which I can read out now. He's not really trying to answer the question of what to do about pagan Christs, but here it is. Speaking of the history of stories, and especially fairy stories, we may say that the pot of soup, the cauldron of story, has always been boiling, and to it have continually been added new bits, dainty and undainty. The other thing you can look at from Tolkien on this particular subject was the poem he wrote after he and Lewis had their famous late-night chat on Addison's Walk in September 1931. It's called Mythopoeia. Maybe I'll make a separate video on it one day. But there is another oft-quoted Catholic who expresses himself freely and sharply, and that's Gilbert Keith Chesterton. But part of the trouble with Chesterton is while he's very quotable,
throwing your grandmother into the sky is not good behaviour, but it is perfectly good taste. The student cannot make a scientific statement about the savage because the savage is not making a scientific statement about the world. Myths provide a man with a calendar, but they don't give him a creed.
So while he's very quotable, he's actually quite difficult to follow sometimes, and it can be helpful to go through his stuff quite slowly, with a pen.
Yes, this actually requires some careful attention.
So let's go to the Everlasting Man and the specific chapter that is most relevant for our email, chapter 5, Man and Mythologies. Essentially, Chesterton is bemoaning the fact that mythologies and fables often get studied by people who aren't very, well, excited by mythologies and fables. For some reason I have never heard explained, it is only the minority of unpoetical people who are allowed to write critical studies of these popular poems. He goes on, when the professor is told by the Polynesian that once there was nothing except a great feathered serpent, unless the learned man feels a thrill and a half-temptation to wish it were true, he is no judge of such things at all. So if you don't enjoy stories, then maybe you shouldn't be putting yourself forward to talk about them. Just to be clear, he doesn't mean you have to like all the stories. Some things are awful and should never have been given the green light from Pixar. He just means you should get what stories do and what the imagination does and enjoy them as stories and not try to turn them into something else. He says that a lot of the ancient stories and tribal tales are psychology of daydreams, and that the people who tell them, and even those who worship them, aren't usually trying to say something factual about the world. They're basically just trying to enjoy themselves, and coming up with stories is a great way to do that. They are also trying to express something about the weird and wonderful place they actually live, which is why he says a lot about myths and folklore being local. Now, when you add into this some of the stuff about the gods of the nations and Lewis's stuff about the divine, diabolical, and human elements, we realize that the myths and the stories of old are a world to explore with theological confidence that it shouldn't shake our faith. Some of it resembles the story of Jesus and his resurrection especially, and some of it is fun and playful and resembles the freedom of childhood. Also, there are significant degrees of sincerity in different myths and stories. Not everything is taken as seriously as everything else. He also makes reference to James Fraser's hugely influential book on comparative mythology called The Golden Bough, published in 1890. It's largely discredited by today's anthropologists for being too Christocentric. Who saw that coming?
So what about a reformed position? Part of the challenge is that reformed mythology hasn't typically tried to answer mythology questions. It's actually quite tricky to find much on this from a distinctively reformed point of view. It's largely because it's a bit of a dead topic. But I wonder whether all this mythology stuff about the Greek gods and the Norse gods and the Egyptians and a re-enchanted wonder of the universe and obsessive online fandoms are reintroducing the mythological perspective of life again. Anyway, if you do type what do Reformed Christians think about mythology in Google, one of the first things that comes up is this from Ligonier, talking about the idea of chance. Ancient mythology and modern science hold one thing in common. Both are trying to explain mysteries. Though they may differ in their conclusions, each inquiry is equally concerned with discovering why things are the way they are. Mythology has its literary, linguistic, and artistic uses, but it has been rejected as a way of explaining reality because it obscures that which it seeks to explain. So the starting point is that mythology should be considered etiological. It's trying to explain something that science has now relegated it to history. This article is about why I think this potentially goes off in the wrong direction from the outset. If Lewis and Chesterton are right, that's not really the point. It's less about trying to explain natural processes and more to do with the human imagination. Chesterton says, mythology is not a voice of a priest or a prophet saying these things are, it is the voice of a dreamer and an idealist crying, why cannot these things be? But Chesterton concedes that different stories are told in order to do different things. Some of the stories may be pretty, and some silly, and some perhaps dirty. The important thing is that they must be judged as stories.
So there may be some myths which are told in order to try to explain something. They may have a purpose to instruct as to the way things are. Another key aspect is the Reformed doctrine of revelation. In this, man is essentially clueless apart from what God has revealed of himself in natural revelation through the things that have been made, Romans 1, and special revelation, God's action and speech in the world. This revelation is by his word, the eternal Logos, who is Christ. As Chesterton says again, the rivers of mythology and philosophy run parallel and do not mingle until they meet in the sea of Christendom. There's another Reformed quotation I'd like to throw in at this point. It's from theologian and former Dutch Prime Minister Abraham Kuyper. It's the Abraham Kuyper quotation that everybody who knows an Abraham Kuyper quotation will quote. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. So Jesus is Lord of the universe, and that means that he's Lord over the human imagination too. He created it. It was his idea, and all human imaginative work sits under his judgment. And here's a biblical quotation that I like, which helps too. My email friend actually mentioned it. At the dedication of the temple, when all the materials have been gathered to start the assembly, David prays, all things come from you, O Lord, and of your own have we given you. Sometimes it gets said in church services once the offering has been taken. Now, this isn't obviously particularly directed to the what to do with those other stories of God's dying and rising again question, but I do think it helps to frame the whole thing. He's talking particularly about the physical materials they have gathered to build the temple, but the human imagination fits into the category of all things. The doctrine of creation means that human creation, even when it is trying to avoid telling the Jesus story, can't really help but tell us something about the Jesus story. Because that's the story that runs through every square inch of the cosmos. Even when the demons are trying to mix in other stuff to subvert that story, they cannot help but show something of it. That means that all the stories can only be rightly understood or told within a Christian framework. Even if the stories are not that deep, and even if the stories are showing the alternative, it's always the alternative to the genuine. Sometimes in Reformed circles, people talk about the noetic effects of sin. That's considered as part of the doctrine of the fall. When we say that man is totally depraved, we mean that all his faculties have been affected by sin. Man, in his rationality, cannot find God. But in addition to the noetic effects of sin, we can also think about the poetic effects of sin. Yeah? You see what I did there? It means that man is also incapable of finding God with his imagination. Man cannot reach God through his reason, and man cannot reach God through his imagination. So we're kind of locked into this situation in which we can't help but tell distorted versions of the Jesus story through our mythologies and our fables, but they are never sufficient to free us from our bondage to decay. We need the real myth, which became fact without ceasing to be myth, because it is only Christ that saves, not a vague understanding of a story of a dying and rising God or a story of self-sacrifice. We don't need all the parallels to parallel. We don't need everything to correlate directly. There's plenty of room in the doctrines of creation, sin, and redemption which allow us to find interesting things to think about in the ancient myths and even episodes of Bluey.
I still haven't made a single video about Bluey. I should do that. Yes, you should.
But once we know that these stories cannot bring salvation, we can properly appreciate them as stories. So part of the challenge is that this sort of stuff isn't typically tackled by Reformed Christians, and when it is, sadly, it doesn't seem to be very enjoyable. And that's kind of why this channel exists, to help me think about this stuff and to hopefully actually give the impression that doing it from a place of enjoying Christ and enjoying the stories might actually work. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments.
But you haven't actually responded to the email, have you? You've just made a video instead. Yeah, I probably should email him back.
Please do remember the media consumption is optional. You are under no obligation to watch videos I've made because I haven't responded to emails about Jesus and mythology. I'm Reformed mythologist Nate Morgan Locke. I'm glad you were here.